They've got the music down, the harmonies, they're just amazing.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog.
These guys are talented, they're funny, it's a blast.
Another road where maybe I could see another kind of mind. Yeah.
We always come see the Wanna Beatles. They just play the best music in the world.
Penny Lane.
It's a great concert.
Ed Sullivan.
Thank you, all you teenagers out there.
I've been following them for about 5 years, and wherever they are, you'll find me.
We hope you will enjoy the show. Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Sit back and let the evening go.
The Charlie Checker Show, and I'm your host for today's show. We have a very dedicated author. She has written a fantastic expanded biography on John Lennon, yes, that very lead singer of the famous group, the Beatles. And also the book Should Have Been There. Kessler's been writing wrote the first novel on John Lennon's series in 1986, spanning 20 years, positioning herself as one of the top Lennon research authorities by conducting multiple interviews in Liverpool, the UK, and the United States, collecting and reading hundreds of books about Lennon, by utilizing numerous interviews, DVDs, CDs, and periodicals. She also teaches classes on the Beatles for public schools, colleges, and has advised numerous Beatle authors about the facts versus the myths of John Lennon's life. Now, Kessler's first 3 books have been received with positive reviews and acclaimed as the only factional narrative biography, to quote Beatles author and Mercury Beat creator Bill Harry. Others also have referred to her books as expanded biographies of Lennon. So pinned in the narrative histories, they allow the reader to be the proverbial fly on the wall at all events in John Lennon's life. The books are documented with thousands of footnotes and references, as well as endnotes with additional data. She also has dual degrees in English and in history, a master's in English, University of Maryland. She also speaks professionally to organizations all over the world and was a keynote speaker for the Pennsylvania State Convention of the Daughters of the British Empire, and has written for Beatle Fan magazine, Beatles News, and numerous other publications. In late November 2008, she published Should Have Been There, about the life of John Lennon from 1940 to 1961. And in October 2009, she released Shivering Inside, covering the Lennon years of signing with Epstein, acquiring Ringo as the Beatles' drummer, and the Beatles' subsequent rise to British fame. The third volume she wrote, She Loves You, from April 1953 to March 1964, was released in 2014. That details the life of John Lennon and of the Beatles as they exist in the whirlwind of worldwide Beatlemania. Jude Sutherland Kessler is a radio host also for the John Lennon Hour on Blog Talk Radio each Thursday evening at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. She has interviewed Pete Best, Dennis Ferrani, Frida Kelly, Richard Langham, and many other primary sources who played pivotal roles in the Beatles story. She also writes a bi-monthly blog for the Fest of Beatles fans. Now, growing up, I listened to the Beatles, and I was very young when Beatlemania hit the U.S., but never knowing until now much about them or their lives. But this author, Jude Kessler, of Should Have Been There and Shivering Inside, took me on a journey right into their everyday lives, especially John, where we have all made that expression at one time or another. Wouldn't it be great to be the fly on the wall in that conversation, or when this happened in history, or that happened? This author, Jude Kessler, made me believe that I was right there, right next to John, seeing what he was seeing, hearing what he was hearing, feeling what he was feeling, even the smells, from his cigarette smoke to the others, or the stale beer smell in the bars. I felt if I was sitting right there. So I can hardly wait for our listeners to be introduced to her. If you're just joining us, we have with us today an expert that has written an expanded biography of John Lennon in the series, Jude Sutherland Kessler. Welcome, Jude. We're so excited to have you with us.
Well, thank you, Charlie. It is great to be here. There's nothing that I love more than being a storyteller. One of my dear friends, Jacob Michael, I speak to a lot of groups, and he said, Jude, you're at your best when you just tell the story. Just read from the book. And that's been my life's goal since I was a little girl, to be able to tell the story so that people would feel as if they're there. So I'm very honored that you feel that that's what I've achieved.
It must have took a lot of dedication and research went into this series of biographies. I know from reading the reviews and the acknowledgments that you have a huge support system. Most importantly, your husband, your children, your parents, host of friends, acquaintances, and colleagues. Tell our listeners, what did your family think when you started on this journey?
Well, of course, anytime that you tell someone you're getting ready to write a comprehensive biography of someone's life, they have to think you're just a little bit nuts. But I really felt called to do this. I felt like this was what I was here on this earth to do. I've been working on it for over 30 years. To complete the entire project is going to take me a total of about 46 years to complete. I had originally intended to make this just one book. I thought that Should Have Been There would have been the book. But when I got to 1,000 pages, and John was only 21 years old, I realized I am not going to make it. So I then came to Plan B, which was doing 3 books, telling John's childhood and teen years, the Beatle years, and then his solo career. But when I started writing book 2, Shivering Inside, and was right at 750 pages after the very first year, 1961-62, again, reality sets in. You realize there's no way you're going to do this in 3 books. So it is, just like J.K. Rowling's series, a 9-book series. It will take John all the way through his life. Just like you said in the intro, people will read it as a narrative or a novel, but it is absolutely factual, and every step is documented, and everything that the Beatles do is questioned and examined from the viewpoint of every biographer that ever wrote about them. I did have amazing help, incredible support from my husband, who took me to Liverpool 7 times. The very first year that we went to Liverpool, because we had to see every place that John grew up, his classrooms, the pubs that the early quarrymen played in, every place that they performed in Latham and Litherland and Blackpool and everywhere. We put 900 miles on our rental car, seeing and photographing everything so that I could write about it in great detail. We went back 6 more times, and we did interviews, usually about 3 to 4 interviews a day. My husband took the notes. He transcribed the notes. He's done everything, even the artwork on the cover of my 3rd book, She Loves You, is his artwork. So he has been incredibly supportive. I do want to say a word about the other members of my family for authors out there who might be listening. My mom was wonderfully supportive. She passed away about 2 years ago, but I used to call my mom and dad every day and read them a chapter a day, and she loved it. And if I would get busy and miss a couple of days, she'd call me and say, "Where's my story?" Very supportive. My dad and my other members of my family, of course, my son and daughter-in-law have been very supportive, but the other members of my family have not been one bit supportive. In fact, at one point, my sister didn't even know where her books were that I had given her. So to those of you who have a dream and believe that you are called to follow that dream, don't let other people dissuade you from doing what you know is right and what you are called to do. My father routinely apologizes to whole groups of people, strangers, saying my daughter's wasted her life being a writer when she could have been a doctor. So know that when you are called to finish and complete a task, you must do it regardless. You may be blessed with great people like my husband, and you may be thrown naysayers along your path, but pursue it. Be a storyteller.
Yes, I think that's true, Jude, because you want to be true to yourself. You know, I've been through many jobs.
And what you're called to do.
Right here, what I'm doing, I believe. But I do
right.
I do side jobs as well. But I do what I enjoy, and this I enjoy. So what did you think when you first went to Liverpool? What did you think, when and what did you think of the people there, and how did they respond to you?
I had supposed that Liverpool would be a bleak, grimy, industrial town. That's what I was prepared for. It was anything but that. The very first day that we were in Liverpool, I went to bed crying with a sick headache, and my husband said, "What in the world is wrong with you? You have wanted to come here all your life. We raised the money to come here. What is wrong?" And I said, "The people of Liverpool are all just like the Beatles. They're all wonderful. The Beatles weren't special. Everybody here is like that." And he said, "So instead of being in love with the Beatles, why don't you fall in love with Liverpool?" And I did. It is the warmest, friendliest place on planet Earth. When I would write a chapter, I would send my chapter to the people about whom I had written, whether that was June Furlong, who was the life model at Liverpool College of Art, John's dear friend, or whether it was Bill Harry, who wrote the very first music fanzine magazine, Mersey Beat, or whether it was Rod Murray, who roomed with John in college. I would send them all their chapters, and they would painstakingly correct them. Bill Harry, for example, said, "Jude, when you have me with John and ye crack, you've got us in the wrong room. Move us to the back room, put us under the painting of Lord Nelson, and you have me drinking ale. I only drink bitter." Well, with detail like that, how can you go wrong? Each person in Liverpool, 4 should have been there, Volume 1, worked unfailingly keenly to make sure that I got it right, down to you have my hair in a French twist, but you forgot to mention that I had a wisp that came down on the left side of my neck. That's how detailed it was. When I got to book 2, Richard Langham, whom you mentioned in the intro, who worked at what we now call Abbey Road, would never have been called Abbey Road back in that day because no one even knew what road it was on. It was called EMI. He worked with me shoulder to shoulder to make sure that we got everything in the recording studio exactly correct, and helped me to get the documentation from the Beatles recording sessions so that we could use the words that they said in studio as the dialogue. People have been so friendly, so warm. I must say there is no place on earth like Liverpool.
Well, that is just wonderful. It sounds like you had a wonderful time doing the research and getting to know everyone there.
It was great. We were very fortunate to have been there when things were happening with the Beatles and to be included in a lot of special events. They had the Liverpool premiere of the movie Backbeat about the Beatles' Hamburg days during one of my visits, and we were very fortunate to be able to go to the after party for the film. We saw the premiere, got to walk the red carpet. It was all extremely surreal, you know, what kind of life am I living? And then at the after party at the John Lennon bar in Matthew Street, we were having dinner with Alan Williams, the Beatles' first manager, and his date for the evening, Beryl Adams, who worked with Brian Epstein at NIMS, worked with the Beatles for years and years and years. But she was also married to the DJ at the Cavern Club, Bob Wooler, so I was hearing all of her wonderful stories. And during the process of the evening, we had to excuse ourselves for a short time to go across the street to the Cavern Club, where we'd been invited to a party there as well. Well, when we came back, the owner of the John Lennon bar and he and his wife had taken our seats, and that was no problem. We just stood and chatted. We were finished with dinner. There was no reason for us to sit back down at the table. And Alan Williams, the Beatles' first manager, shoved the guy and said, "That's Jude's chair. Get out." And the guy said, "I'm not getting out. They're finished. I own this place. I'm having dinner." Well, it broke into an all-out fist fight. And my husband grabbed me and said, "If I had told you when you were 9 years old and falling in love with the Beatles that the Beatles' first manager and the owner of the John Lennon bar would be having a fist fight over you in Liverpool, would you have ever believed it?" I said, "Hey, this is the greatest night of my life."
What a wonderful story. How cool is that?
It was crazy. It was crazy.
So this research alone, this part just took you about 20 years, so you have like 26 more years to go.
Well, I did 20 years on Should Have Been There. I did 5 years because I had laid the groundwork when I did the 20 years on Should Have Been There. I did 5 years on Shivering Inside, an additional 5.5 years on Volume 3, She Loves You. So I've been going over 30 years now, and getting ready to hit the 31-year anniversary coming up in about 4 weeks. And I tried to spend at least 5, if not 6 days a week, working 8 hours a day on it. The last 2 years since my mom passed have been rather tough because I'm now the caregiver for my 96-year-old dad. I see him at least once, if not twice a week. But I'm trying very hard to stay on schedule, and the 4th book, which will be Should Have Known Better, will be out next year, and that'll cover 1964 and 1965, those huge years of Beatlemania. So still working.
Well, I know that certainly worth the wait. All of them will be. And I know our listeners are thrilled to know that you'll be reading from your second book, Shivering Inside, a portion of that. Jude has agreed to do a reading of her choosing today from Book 2, Shivering Inside. Our listeners are waiting, Jude.
On the 11th of February, 1963, the Beatles were given 12 hours and about 45 minutes to record their very first album, or LP as it was called. They were in EMI Studios that day and had been there since 10 o'clock that morning. When we pick up the story, it is 10:02 p.m. They have about 43 minutes to go. And John is very ill, running fever about 103, sore throat, and all the symptoms of flu. We'll pick up the story right there. By the time the Beatles had stowed their equipment and taken a quick break in the loo, The others were already settled in the canteen. George Martin had brewed a strong pot of coffee, and Norman Smith had assembled the sugar, cream, spoons, cups, and napkins in the center of the break table. Paul had only to pour. "So," George Martin took the first cup with a nod, "what do you have that could be recorded expediently, but that would also be a showstopper, a fitting close for the LP?" "They've their traditional final number," Brian offered quietly, glancing at John to make sure he wasn't overstepping his managerial bounds. "Right," Paul nodded, handing Brian a cup of coffee as well. "Twist and shout. It's always gangbusters, as they say in America." But that's Johnny's number," George protested. "And he's exhausted. He's fagged out." "Well, you could, of course, schedule a time to return," George Martin began very reluctantly. No, virtually impossible." Brian passed a cup down to Norman Smith. "The boys have 2 engagements tomorrow, a Valentine's dance in West Derby Thursday, a rescheduled engagement that simply can't be broken in Birmingham on Friday, a John Smith production venue in Oxford this Saturday, the taping of Thank Your Lucky Stars on Sunday, and—" All right, Brian, all right," George Martin threw his hands up, chuckling. "We've got the general idea." Paul reached across the table, extending a coffee to second engineer Richard Langham. "Sugar, if you don't mind." 2, please," Langham requested. Paul took back the cup, filling the request with an agreeable dip of his head. "John?" Brian eyed the boy with concern. The rhythm guitarist was crumpled in his chair, his arms folded, his eyelids heavy. "Cream! 3 sugars, liberal Scotch," John ordered. 2 out of 3, Paul chirped. "Look, if I'm being honest, I'd rather have milk, actually." John looked around, hoping to find a carton somewhere on the counter. Richard Langham hopped up to fetch one for him. No, what I meant, John," Brian turned his full attention to Lennon, is, are you all right?" "Me throat's on fire," John admitted. "Well, yes. You've been at it for over 12 hours, you know," George flew to John's defense. "No one's admonishing John or any of you," George Martin stepped in. "We're amazed at all of you, actually. I mean, your staying power's beyond commendable." "But the question remains," Brian looked at John again. "Do you want to complete the LP this evening, or would you prefer to wait a week or so to do the final song? Remember, you have several cavern gigs and the rest of the Helen Shapiro tour to complete." "When could they return?" George Martin slid the last 2 cups toward George and Ringo as Paul stirred a modest amount of sweet into his own. "Well, if memory serves, and I can't be certain of this," Brian racked his brain, "but I'm fairly sure they have Sunday the 24th free. Other than that—" George Martin frowned. "The powers that be aren't wild about opening the studio on Sunday. Very rigid, you understand, and—" "I'll do it," John said in as few words as possible. You'll do it? You'll sing Twist and Shout?" Martin was incredulous. John nodded, downing the cold milk Langham had given him. "But, John, it's daunting," Brian reminded him. "Even when you're 100%, it's quite—" "He said he'll do it." Paul spared John the banter. "And when John's up for it, John's up for it." George Martin glanced at the clock and then at Norman Smith, who pulled the corners of his mouth down and shrugged as if to say, "It's all right by me." "Well," Martin said, "if we're going to record another number, we'd best be at it. We're on borrowed time, as it were." 10:20 p.m., 20 minutes to go. The lights in the recording studio had already been dimmed and the air turned off. Richard Langham hit the buttons that put them all back in business again, but the neon bulbs would take several minutes to restore. The Beatles resumed their places in deep shadow that was cavern-like, comfortingly familiar. Paul and George tuned while Ringo wiggled his fingers, trying to get the blood flowing in the cold room. George followed suit, shaking his hands. The boys refocused, concentrated. John, who was sweating now, had taken off his wet shirt and stripped to the waist. He stood by the piano, gargling milk and reaching for the very last of his Zoob's lozenges. Milk? Isn't that the very worst possible treatment for congestion? Norman Smith joined George Martin at the overlook window. Yes, but don't tell John, Martin said, as long as he's convinced it works. Then it works, Smith finished. The two men nodded at one another. Brian Epstein paced. He bit his bottom lip. Second engineer Richard Langham cued a fresh tape. In the strangely quiet moment, none of them smiled. When Norman finally said, "Ready when you are, boys," Brian drew the back of his hand across his lips. They were all on pins and needles. Brian knew that Twist and Shout was vocal gymnastics. John purposely placed it last on the playlist each evening because it left his throat raw and bleeding. To pull this off now, this late in the day and under such adverse conditions, would be next to impossible. Brian prayed John had it in him. This LP needed to be released promptly. If the Beatles missed this window of opportunity, all because of chest colds or fatigue, they could well slide back into northern obscurity. John strode to the microphone, his Rick 325 high on his chest, his hair plastered against his forehead. He glanced at Paul, who nodded and moved alongside of him. Then he looked at George and Ringo, just to make sure. "I can do this the once," John rasped. He didn't even waste words saying, "and that's all." The group, determined to make each note and syllable stunning, nodded. They had his back. "Twist and Shout, one take." Norman Smith played with the double entendre of the words, hinting at success. John inhaled, waited a moment, and then exhaled sound. "Well, shake it up, baby, now. Twist and shout." It roared out of him, energetic, suggestive, raw. Twist and Shout had never sounded like this when Phil Medley and Burt Russell had penned it. It had never been this gritty when the Isley Brothers took it to the hit parade. It had only existed as a calypso number, and later as a light-hearted dance tune, a happy-go-lucky trek into the teen world of record spinning. But under John Lennon's purview, the song was a proposition. It was an eye-to-eye, no-holes-barred invitation to much more than dance. And the gruff voice that served it up now made no apologies for his earthy advances. "You know, you got me going, just like I knew you would," John screamed, feeling the blood run down his throat. Brian Epstein's eyes were wide and full of hope. George Martin hardly dared to breathe, wishing the boy triumph. And Norman Smith boosted the mics to the max, praying that the boys would make it all the way through. Paul and George were doing their best. Their oohs and ahs were perfect. Their responses to John's calls were without flaw. Their enthusiasm was untamed and the harmony strong. It was the best night in the Kaiser Keller. It was the happiest night in the Cavern Club. It was the last song of the evening in the new Brighton Tower ballroom. It was all a show could be, and even more. Paul's bass line mirrored George's lead dodge for dodge, and Ringo's sturdy Mersey drumming fearlessly hammered Studio 2. As the lights began to grow brighter and brighter, the song wound up and up to explosion, and when John screamed, "Come on, come on," the studio's soft yellow glow revealed Lennon's leering visage, a face far from blameless or naive. John swaggered. George Martin had dreamed of producing an LP that would let the rest of England, and possibly someday the world, know what these four unusual Liverpool boys were like. He had initially wanted to capture them in their heat and sweat-soaked cavern below the ground. But that eventuality barred. This was the sound he had hoped to elicit, this unvarnished, uncensored magic that made Brian Epstein's group something special. Something special. George Martin shook his head. Even to himself, the phrase sounded trite, silly. It was a sentiment on a birthday card, an anniversary greeting. But listening to the boys build their I'll do you one better Oz all the way up the scale to John's rock and roll scream, there was no other way to describe them. This was something special, something the world would want to hear, and once heard, would never forget.
Awesome. What a wicked story. So cool to be right there will be awesome.
Isn't it amazing? That sick young man brought up by this very determined aunt who believed that you had to do your duty no matter what, and by this creative mother who told him he had music in his bones, and the two women come together in that moment to get him through what most people would have shown. Most people would have just said, I'm too sick to do this. But he does it, and when we hear Twist and Shout, we are hearing that one and only take. When we listen to that on the radio, that's what happened that night.
Well, I'll tell you what, when I listen to it from now on, I won't forget that. How much blood and sweat that young man did for that group to get that done so they could get it out and be famous and do their craft. So tell you what, that was just awesome. Now, that's all the time we have today, so please tell our listeners where they can find you, Jude.
JohnLennonSeries.com is the website. If you prefer to buy and spend a little bit more money, you can go to Amazon. I am on Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, and in every ebook format. Shivering Inside is just on Kindle, but the other books are on all ebook formats. You can also go to thefest.com, which is the Fest for Beatles fans.com, but the lowest prices are on JohnLennonSeries.com, and you can read selections from the other books and find out a little bit more about how this all got started.
Well, Jude, I tell you what, it's been so much fun. Thank you so much for joining us today. We had enjoyed having you so much.
Charlie, thank you. It's a real honor, and I thank you for what you're doing and getting the word about storytellers out to the campfires of the world. You shine on, my friend, shine on.
Thank you so much. And, of course, we want to give credit where credit's due. My research material came from Amazon.com, Goodreads, of course, the books itself, Jude Sutherland Kessler. Also, we'd like to thank Storytellers Campfire and all our sponsors. And last but not least, our listeners, because without all of these put together, this programming would not be possible. This is Charlie Checker saying, don't forget to dance like no one's watching and sing like no one's listening.
She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. She loves you, yeah, 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 yeah. You think you've lost your love? Well, I saw her yesterday. It's you she's thinking of, and she told me what to say. She said she loves you, and you know that can't be bad. But she loves you, and you know you should be glad. She said you hurt her so, she almost